This week's Grimm Fairy Tales, The Raven. There was once upon a time a queen who had a little daughter who was still so young that she had to be carried. One day the child was naughty, and the mother might say what she liked, but the child would not be quiet. Then she became impatient, and as the ravens were flying about the palace, she opened the window and said, "I wish you were a raven and would fly away, and then I should have some rest." Scarcely had she spoken the words before the child was changed into a raven and flew from her arms out of the window. It flew into a dark forest and stayed in it a long time, and the parents heard nothing of their child. Then one day a man was on his way through the forest and heard the raven crying, and followed the voice, and when he came nearer, the bird said, "I am a king's daughter by birth, and am bewitched, but thou canst set me free." "What am I to do?" asked he. She said, "Go further into the forest, and thou wilt find a house wherein sits an aged woman, who will offer thee meat and drink, but you must accept nothing, for if you eatest and drinkest anything, thou wilt fall into a sleep, and then thou wilt not be able to deliver me. In the garden behind the house there is a great heap of tan, and on this thou shalt stand and wait for me. For 3 days I will carry every afternoon at 2 o'clock in a carriage. On the first day 4 white horses will be harnessed to it, then 4 chestnut horses, and lastly 4 black ones. But if thou art not awake, but sleeping, I shall not be set free." The man promised to do everything that she desired, but the raven said, "Alas, I know already that thou wilt not deliver me. Thou wilt accept something from the woman." Then the man once more promised that he would certainly not touch anything, either to eat or to drink. But when he entered the house, the old woman came to him and said, "Poor man, how faint you are. Come and refresh yourself. Eat and drink." "No," said the man, "I will not eat or drink." She, however, let him have no peace and said, "If you will not eat, take 1 drink out of the glass. 1 is nothing." Then he let himself be persuaded and drank. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he went into the garden to the tan heap to wait for the raven. As he was standing there, his weariness all at once became so great that he could not struggle against it, and lay down for a short time. But he was determined not to go to sleep. Hardly, however, had he lain down, then his eyes closed of their own accord, and he fell asleep and slept so soundly that nothing in the world could have aroused him. At 2 o'clock, the raven came driving up with 4 white horses, but she was already in deep grief and said, "I know he is asleep." And when she came into the garden, he was indeed lying there asleep on the heap of tan. She alighted from the carriage, went to him, shook him, and called him, but he did not awake. Next day about noon, the old woman came again and brought him food and drink, but he would not take any of it. But she let him have no rest and persuaded him until at length he again took 1 drink out of the glass. Towards 2 o'clock he went into the garden to the tan heap to wait for the raven, but all at once felt such a great weariness that his limbs would no longer support him. He could not help himself, and was forced to lie down, and fell into a heavy sleep. When the raven drove up with 4 brown horses, she was already full of grief and said, "I know he is asleep." She went to him, but there he lay, sleeping, and there was no waking him. Next day, the old woman asked what was the meaning of this. He was neither eating nor drinking anything. Did he want to die? He replied, I am not allowed to eat or drink, and will not do so." But she set a dish with food and a glass with wine before him, and when he smelt it he could not resist, and swallowed a deep draught. When the time came, he went out into the garden to the heap of tan, and waited for the king's daughter. But he became still more weary than on the day before, and lay down and slept as soundly as if he had been a stone. At 2 o'clock the raven came with 4 black horses, and the coachman and everything else was black. She was already in the deepest grief and said, "I know that he is asleep and cannot deliver me." When she came to him, there he was, lying fast asleep. She shook him and called him, but she could not waken him. Then she laid a loaf beside him, and after that a piece of meat, and thirdly a bottle of wine, and he might consume as much of all of them as he liked, but they would never grow less. After this, she took a gold ring from her finger and put it on his, and her name was graven on it. Lastly, she laid a letter beside him wherein was written what she had given him, and that none of the things would ever grow less, and in it was also written, "I see right well that here you will never be able to deliver me, but if thou art still willing to deliver me, come to the golden castle of Stromberg. It lies in thy power, and that I am certain." And when she had given him all these things, she seated herself in her carriage, and drove to the golden castle of Stromberg. When the man awoke and saw that he had slept, he was sad at heart and said, "She has certainly driven by, and I have not set her free." Then he perceived the things which were lying beside him, and read the letter wherein was written how everything had happened. So he arose and went away, intending to go to the golden castle of Stromberg, but he did not know where it was. After he had walked about the world for a long time, he entered into a dark forest, and walked for 14 days and still could not find his way out. Then it was once more evening, and he was so tired that he lay down in a thicket and fell asleep. Next day he went onwards, and in the evening, as he was again about to lie down beneath some bushes, he heard such a howling and crying that he could not go to sleep. And at the time when people light the candle, he saw one glimmering, and arose and went towards it. Then he came to a house which seemed very small, for in front of it a great giant was standing. He thought to himself, "If I go in, and the giant sees me, it will very likely cost me my life." At length he ventured it and went in. When the giant saw him, he said, "It is well that thou comest, for it is long since I have eaten. I will at once eat thee for my supper." "I'd rather you leave that alone," said the man. "I do not like to be eaten, but if thou hast any desire to eat, I have quite enough here to satisfy thee." "If that be true," said the giant, "thou mayest be easy. I was only going to devour thee because I had nothing else to eat." Then they went and sat down to the table, and the man took out the bread, wine, and meat, which would never come to an end. "This pleases me well," said the giant, and ate to his heart's content. Then the man said to him, "Canst thou tell me where the golden castle of Stromberg is?" The giant said, "I will look at my map. All the towns and villages and houses are to be found on it." He brought out the map which he had in the room and looked for the castle, but it was not to be found on it. "It's no matter," said he. "I have some still larger maps in my cupboard upstairs, and we will look in them." But there too it was in vain. The man now wanted to go onwards, but the giant begged him to wait a few days longer until his brother, who had gone out to bring some provisions, came home. When the brother came home, they inquired about the golden castle of Stromberg. He replied, "When I have eaten and had had enough, I will look in the map." Then he went with them up to his chamber, and they searched in his map but could not find it. Then he brought out still older maps, and they never rested until they found the golden castle of Stromberg, but it was many thousands of miles away. "How am I to get there?" asked the man. The giant said, "I have 2 hours' time, during which I will carry you into the neighborhood, but after that I must be at home to suckle the child that we have." So the giant carried the man to about 100 leagues from the castle, and said, "Thou canst very well walk the rest of the way alone." And he turned back, but the man went onwards day and night, until at length he came to the golden castle of Stromberg. It stood on a glass mountain, and the bewitched maiden drove in her carriage round the castle, and then went inside it. He rejoiced when he saw her and wanted to climb up to her, but when he began to do so, he always slipped down the glass again. And when he saw that he could not reach her, he was filled with trouble and said to himself, "I will stay down here below and wait for her." So he built himself a hut and stayed in it for a whole year, and every day saw the king's daughter driving about above, but never could go to her. Then one day he saw from his hut 3 robbers who were beating each other, and cried to them, "God be with ye." They stopped when they heard the cry, but as they saw no one, they once more began to beat each other, and that too most dangerously. So he again cried, "God be with thee." Again they stopped, looked round about, but as they saw no one, they went on beating each other. Then he cried for the 3rd time, "God be with thee," and thought, "I must see what these 3 are about," and went thither and asked why they were beating each other so furiously. One of them said that he found a stick, and that when he struck a door with it, that door would spring open. The next said that he found a mantle, and that whenever he put it on, he was invisible. But the 3rd said he had found a horse on which a man could ride everywhere, even up the glass mountain. And now they did not know whether they ought to have these things in common, or whether they ought to divide them. Then the man said, "I will give you something in exchange for these 3 things. Money indeed have I not, but I have other things of more value. But first I must try yours to see if you have told the truth." Then they put him on the horse, threw the mantle round him, and gave him the stick in his hand. And when he had all these things, they were no longer able to see him. So he gave them some vigorous blows and cried, "Now, vagabonds, you have got what you deserve. Are you satisfied?" And he rode up the glass mountain, but when he came in front of the castle at the top, it was shut. Then he struck the door with his stick, and it sprang open immediately. He went in and ascended the stairs until he came to a hall where the maiden was sitting with a golden cup full of wine before her. She, however, could not see him because he had the mantle on, and when he came up to her, he drew from his fingers the ring which she had given him, and threw it into the cup so that it rang. Then she cried, "That is my ring, so the man who is to set me free must be here." They searched the whole castle and did not find him, but he had gone out, and had seated himself on the horse and thrown off the mantle. When they came to the door, they saw him, and cried aloud in their delight. Then he alighted and took the king's daughter in his arms. But she kissed him and said, "Now hast thou set me free, and tomorrow we will celebrate our wedding." The Crystal Ball. There was once an enchantress who had 3 sons who loved each other as brothers, but the old woman did not trust them and thought they wanted to steal her power from her. So she changed the eldest into an eagle, which was forced to dwell in the Rocky Mountains, and was often seen sweeping in great circles in the sky. The second she changed into a whale, which lived in the deep sea, and all that was seen of it was that it sometimes spouted up a great jet of water in the air. Each of them only bore his human form for only 2 hours daily. The third son, who was afraid she might change him into a raging wild beast, a bear perhaps, or a wolf, went secretly away. He had heard that a king's daughter who was bewitched was imprisoned in the castle of the Golden Sun, and was waiting for deliverance. Those, however, who tried to free her risked their lives. 23 youths had already died a miserable death, and now only one other might make the attempt, after which no more must come. And as his heart was without fear, he caught an idea of seeking out the castle of the Golden Sun. He had already traveled about for a long time without being able to find it, when he came by chance into a great forest, and did not know the way out of it. All at once he saw in the distance 2 giants, who made a sign to him with their hands, and when he came to them they said, "We are quarreling about a cap, and which of us it belongs to, and as we are equally strong, neither of us can get the better of the other. The small men are cleverer than we are, so we will leave the decision to thee." "How can you dispute about an old cap?" said the youth. "Thou dost not know what properties it has. It is a wishing cap. Whosoever puts it on can wish himself away wherever he likes, and in an instant he will be there." "Give me the cap," said the youth. "I will go a short distance off, and when I call you, you must run a race, and the cap shall belong to the one who gets first to me." He put it on and went away, and thought of the king's daughter, forgot the giants, and walked continually onward. At length he sighed from the very bottom of his heart, and cried, "Ah, if I were but at the castle of the Golden Sun!" And hardly had the words passed his lips than he was standing on a high mountain before the gate of the castle. He entered and went through all the rooms, until the last he found the king's daughter. But how shocked he was when he saw her! She had an ashen gray face full of wrinkles, blear eyes, and red hair. "Are you the king's daughter, whose beauty the whole world praises?" cried he. "Ah," she answered, "this is not my form. Human eyes can only see me in this state of ugliness. But that thou mayest know what I am like, look in the mirror. It does not let itself be misled. It will show thee my image as it is in truth." She gave him the mirror in his hand, and he saw therein the likeness of the most beautiful maiden on earth, and saw, too, how the tears were rolling down her cheeks with grief. Then he said, "How canst thou be set free? I fear no danger." She said, "He who gets the crystal ball and holds it before the enchanter will destroy his power with it, and I shall resume my true shape. Ah." She added, "So many have already gone to meet death for this, and thou art so young. I grieve that thou shouldest encounter such great danger." "Nothing can keep me from doing it," said he. "But tell me what I must do." "Thou shalt know everything," said the king's daughter. "When thou descendest the mountain on which the castle stands, a wild bull will stand below by a spring, and thou must fight with it. And if thou hast the luck to kill it, a fiery bird will spring out of it, which bears in its body a burning egg, and in the egg the crystal ball lies like a yolk. The bird will not, however, let the egg fall until forced to do so. And if it falls on the ground, it will flame up and burn everything that is near, and melt even ice itself, and with it the crystal ball. And then all thy troubles will have been in vain." The youth went down to the spring, where the bull snorted and bellowed at him. After a long struggle, he plunged his sword in the animal's body, and it fell down. Instantly, a fiery bird arose from it, and was about to fly away, but the young man's brother, the eagle, who was passing between the clouds, swooped down, hunted it away to the sea, and struck it with his beak until, in its extremity, it let the egg fall. The egg did not, however, fall into the sea, but on a fisherman's hut which stood on the shore, and the hut began at once to smoke and was about to break out in flames. Then arose in the sea waves as high as a house. They streamed over the hut and subdued the fire. The other brother, the whale, had come swimming to them, and had driven the water up on high. When the fire was extinguished, the youth sought for the egg, and happily found it. It was not yet melted, but the shell was broken by being so suddenly cooled with the water, and he could take out the crystal ball unhurt. When the youth went to the enchanter and held it before him, the latter said, "My power is destroyed, and from this time forth thou art the king of the castle of the golden sun. With this canst thou likewise give back to thy brothers their human form." Then the youth hastened to the king's daughter, and when he entered the room, she was standing there in the full splendor of her beauty, and joyfully they exchanged rings with each other. The Donkey. Once on a time there lived a king and a queen who were rich and had everything they wanted, but no children. The queen lamented over this day and night and said, "I am like a field on which nothing grows." At last God gave her her wish, but when the child came into the world, it did not look like a human child, but was a little donkey. When the mother saw that, her lamentations and outcries began in real earnest. She said she would far rather have had no child at all than have a donkey, and that they were to throw it into the water that the fishes might devour it. But the king said, "No, since God has sent him, he shall be my son and heir, and after my death sit on the royal throne and wear the kingly crown." The donkey therefore was brought up and grew bigger, and his ears grew up beautifully high and straight. He was, however, of a merry disposition, jumped about, played, and had special pleasures in music, so that he went to a celebrated musician and said, "Teach me thine art, that I may play the lute as well as thou dost." "Ah, dear little master," answered the musician, "that would come very hard to you. Your fingers are certainly not suited to it, and are far too big. I am afraid the strings would not last." No excuses were of any use. The donkey was determined to play the lute. He was persevering and industrious, and at last learnt to do it, as well as the master himself. The young lordling once went out walking full of thought and came to a well. He looked into it, and in the mirror clear water saw his donkey form. He was so distressed about it that he went out into the wide world and only took with him one faithful companion. They traveled up and down, and at last they came into a kingdom where an old king reigned who had an only but wonderfully beautiful daughter. The donkey said, "Here we will stay," knocked at the gate, and cried, "A guest is without. Open, that he may enter." As, however, the gate was not opened, he sat down, took his lute, and played it in the most delightful manner with his 2 forefeet. Then the doorkeeper opened his eyes most wonderfully wide, and ran to the king and said, "Outside by the gate sits a young donkey which plays the lute, as well as an experienced master." "Then let the musician come to me," said the king. When, however, a donkey came in, Everyone began to laugh at the lute player, and now the donkey was asked to sit down and eat with the servants. He, however, was unwilling and said, "I am no common stable ass. I am a noble one." Then they said, "If that is what thou art, seat thyself with the men of war." "No," said he, "I will sit by the king." The king smiled and said good-humoredly, "Yes, it shall be as thou wilt, little ass. Come here to me." Then he asked, "Little ass, how does my daughter please thee?" The donkey turned his head towards her, looked at her, nodded and said, "I like her above measure. I have never yet seen anyone so beautiful as she is." "Well then, thou shalt sit next to her too," said the king. "That is exactly what I wish," said the donkey, and he placed himself by her side, ate and drank, and knew how to behave himself daintily and cleanly. When the noble beast had stayed a long time at the king's court, he thought, "What good does all this do me? I shall still have to go home again." Let his head hang sadly, and went to the king and asked for his dismissal. But the king had grown fond of him and said, "Little ass, what ails thee? Thou lookest as sour as a jug of vinegar. I will give thee what thou wantest. Dost thou want gold?" "No," said the donkey, and shook his head. "Dost thou want jewels and rich dress?" "No." "Dost thou wish for half my kingdom?" "Indeed, no." Then said the king, "If I did but know what would make thee content, wilt thou have my pretty daughter to wife?" "Ah, yes," said the ass, "I should indeed like her." And all at once he became quite merry and full of happiness, for that was exactly what he was wishing for. So a great and splendid wedding was held in the evening. When the bride and bridegroom were led into their bedroom, the king wanted to know if the ass would behave well, and ordered a servant to hide himself there. When they were both within, the bridegroom bolted the door, looked around, and as he believed that they were quite alone, he suddenly threw off his ass's skin, and stood there in the form of a handsome royal youth. "Now," said he, "thou seest who I am, and seest also that I am not unworthy of thee." Then the bride was glad and kissed him and loved him dearly. When morning came, he jumped up, put his animal's skin on again, and no one could have guessed what kind of a form was hidden beneath it. Soon came the old king. "Ah," cried he, "is the little ass merry? But surely thou art sad," said he to his daughter, "that thou hast not got a proper man for thy husband." "Oh no, dear father, I love him as well as if he were the handsomest in the world, and I will keep him as long as I live." The king was surprised, but the servant who had concealed himself came and revealed everything to him. The king said, "That cannot be true." "Then watch for yourself the next night, and you will see it with your own eyes. And hark you, Lord King, if you were to take his skin away and throw it in the fire, he would be forced to show himself in his true shape." "Thy advice is good," said the king. And at night, when they were asleep, he stole in, and when he got to the bed, he saw by the light of the moon a noble-looking youth lying there, and the skin lay stretched on the ground. So he took it away, and had a great fire lighted outside, and threw the skin into it, and remained by himself until it was all burnt to ashes. As, however, he was anxious to know how the robbed man would behave himself, he stayed awake the whole night and watched. When the youth had slept his sleep out, he got up by the first light of morning, and wanted to put on the ass's skin, but it was not to be found. On this he was alarmed, and full of grief and anxiety, said, "Now, I shall have to contrive to escape." But when he went out, there stood the king, who said, "My son, whither away in such haste? What hast thou in mind? Stay here, thou art such a handsome man. Thou shalt not go away from me. I will now give thee half my kingdom, and after my death thou shalt have the whole of it." "Then I hope that what begins so well may end well, and I will stay with you," said the youth. And the old man gave him half the kingdom, and in a year's time, when he died, the youth had the whole, and after the death of his father, he had another kingdom as well, and lived in all magnificence. Hans the Hedgehog. There was once a countryman who had money and land in plenty, but how rich soever he was, one thing was still wanting in his happiness. He had no children. Often when he went into the town with the other peasants, they mocked him and asked why he had no children. At last, he became angry, and when he got home he said, "I will have a child, even if it be a hedgehog." Then his wife had a child that was a hedgehog in the upper part of his body, and a boy in the lower. And when she saw the child, she was terrified and said, "See, there thou hast brought ill luck on us." Then said the man, "What can be done now? The boy must be christened, but we shall not be able to get a good father for him." The woman said, "And we cannot call him anything else but Hans the Hedgehog." When he was christened, the parson said, "He cannot go into any ordinary bed because of his spikes." So a little straw was put behind the stove, and Hans the Hedgehog was laid on it. His mother could not suckle him, for he would have pricked her with his quills. So he lay there behind the stove for 8 years, and his father was tired of him and thought, "If he would but die." He did not die, however, but remained lying there. Now it happened that there was a fair in the town, and the peasant was about to go to it, and asked his wife what he should bring back with him for her. "A little meat and a couple of white rolls which are wanted for the house," said she. Then he asked the servant, and she wanted a pair of slippers and some stockings with clocks. At last he said also, "And what wilt thou have, Hans my Hedgehog?" "Dear father," he said, "do bring me bagpipes." When therefore the father came home again, he gave his wife what he had bought for her, meat and white rolls, and then he gave the maid the slippers and the stockings with clocks. And lastly, he went behind the stove and gave Hans the Hedgehog the bagpipes. And when Hans the Hedgehog had the bagpipes, he said, "Dear father, do go to the forge and get me the cockshod, and then I will ride away and never come back again." On this, the father was delighted to think that he was going to get rid of him, and had the cockshod for him. And when it was done, Hans the Hedgehog got on it, and rode away, but took swine and asses with him, which he intended to keep in the forest. When they got there, he made the cock fly on to a high tree with him, and there he sat for many a long year, and watched his asses and swine until the herd was quite large. And his father knew nothing about him. While he was sitting in the tree, however, he played his bagpipes and made music which was very beautiful. Once a king came traveling by, who had lost his way, and heard the music. He was astonished at it, and sent his servant forth to look all round and see from whence this music came. He spied about, but saw nothing but a little animal sitting up aloft on the tree, which looked like a cock with a hedgehog on it, which made this music. Then the king told the servant he was to ask why he sat there, and if he knew the road which led to his kingdom. So Hans the Hedgehog descended from the tree and said he would show the way if the king would write a bond and promise him whatever he first met in the royal courtyard as soon as he arrived at home. Then the king thought, I can easily do that. Hans the Hedgehog understands nothing, and I can write what I like. So the king took pen and ink and wrote something, and when he had done it, Hans the Hedgehog showed him the way, and he got safely home. But his daughter, when she saw him from afar, was so overjoyed that she ran to meet him and kissed him. Then he remembered Hans the Hedgehog and told her what had happened, and that he had been forced to promise whatsoever first meet him when he got home, to a very strange animal which sat on a cock as if it were a horse, and made beautiful music, but that instead of writing that he should have what he wanted, he had written that he should not have it. Thereupon the princess was glad, and said he had done well, for she never would have gone away with the hedgehog. Hans the Hedgehog, however, looked after his asses and pigs and was always merry, and sat on the tree and played his bagpipes. Now it came to pass that another king came journeying by with his attendants and runners, and he also had lost his way, and did not know how to get home again because the forest was so large. He likewise heard the beautiful music from a distance and asked his runner what that could be, and told him to go and see. Then the runner went under the tree and saw the cock sitting at the top of it, and Hans the Hedgehog on the cock. The runner asked him what he was about up there. I am keeping my asses and my pigs, but what is your desire? The messenger said that they had lost their way and could not get back into their own kingdom, and asked if he would not show them the way. Then Hans the Hedgehog got down the tree with the cock and told the aged king that he would show him the way, if he would give him for his own whatsoever first met him in front of his royal palace. The king said, Yes, and wrote a promise to Hans the Hedgehog that he should have this. That done, Hans rode on before him on the cock and pointed out the way, and the king reached his kingdom again in safety. When he got to the courtyard, there were great rejoicings. Now he had an only daughter who was very beautiful. She ran to meet him, threw her arms around his neck, and was delighted to have her old father back again. She asked him where in the world he had been so long. So he told her how he had lost his way, and had very nearly not come back at all, but that as he was traveling through a great forest, a creature, half hedgehog, half man, who was sitting astride a cock in a high tree and making music, had shown him the way and helped him to get out, but that in return he had promised him whatsoever first met him in the royal courtyard, and how that was she herself, which made him unhappy now. But on this she promised that, for love of her father, she would willingly go with this Hans if he came. Hans the Hedgehog, however, took care of his pigs, and the pigs multiplied until they became so many in number that the whole forest was filled with them. Then Hans the Hedgehog resolved not to live in the forest any longer, and sent word to his father to have every sty in the village emptied, for he was coming with such a great herd that all might kill who wished to do so. When his father heard that, he was troubled, for he thought Hans the Hedgehog had died long ago. Hans the Hedgehog, however, seated himself on the cock, and drove the pigs before him into the village and ordered the slaughter to begin. Ha! But there was a killing and a chopping that might have been heard 2 miles off. After this, Hans the Hedgehog said, Father, let me have the cock shod once more at the forge, and then I will ride away and never come back as long as I live. Then the father had the cock shod once more, and was pleased that Hans the Hedgehog would never return again. Hans the Hedgehog rode away to the first kingdom. There the king had commanded that whosoever came mounted on a cock, and had bagpipes with him should be shot at, cut down, or stabbed by everyone, so that he might not enter the palace. When therefore Hans the Hedgehog came riding thither, they all pressed forward against him with their pikes. But he spurred the cock, and it flew up over the gate in front of the king's window and lighted there. And Hans cried that the king must give him what he had promised, or he would take both his life and his daughter's. Then the king began to speak his daughter a fair, and to beg her to go away with Hans in order to save her own life and her father's. So she dressed herself in white, and her father gave her a carriage with 6 horses and magnificent attendants together with gold and possessions. She seated herself in the carriage, and placed Hans the Hedgehog beside her with the cock and the bagpipes. And then they took leave and drove away, and the king thought he should never see her again. He was, however, deceived in his expectation, for then they were at a short distance from the town. Hans the Hedgehog took her pretty clothes off and pierced her with his hedgehog's skin until she bled all over. "That is the reward of your falseness," said he. "Go your way. I will not have you." And on that he chased her home again, and she was disgraced for the rest of her life. Hans the Hedgehog, however, rode on further on the cock with his bagpipes, to the dominions of the second king to whom he had shown the way. This one, however, had arranged that if anyone resembling Hans the Hedgehog should come, they were to present arms, give him safe conduct, cry long life to him, and lead him to the royal palace. But when the king's daughter saw him, she was terrified, for he looked quite too strange. She remembered, however, that she could not change her mind, for she had given her promise to her father. So Hans the Hedgehog was welcomed by her, and married to her, and had to go with her to the royal table, and she seated herself by his side, and they ate and drank. When the evening came and they wanted to go to sleep, she was afraid of his squeals, but he told her she was not to fear, for no harm would befall her, and he told the old king that he was to appoint 4 men to watch by the door of the chamber, and light a great fire, and when he entered the room, and was about to get into bed, he would creep out of his hedgehog's skin and leave it lying there by the bedside, and that the men were to run nimbly to it, throw it in the fire, and stay by it until it was consumed. When the clock struck 11, he went into the chamber, stripped off the hedgehog's skin, and left it lying by the bed. Then came the men and fetched it swiftly, and threw it in the fire. And when the fire had consumed it, he was delivered, and lay there in bed in human form. But he was coal-black, as if he had been burnt. The king sent for his physicians, who washed him with precious salves, and anointed him, and he became white, and was a handsome young man. When the king's daughter saw that, she was glad, and the next morning they arose joyfully, ate and drank, and then the marriage was properly solemnized, and Hans the Hedgehog received the kingdom from the aged king. When several years had passed, he went with his wife to his father, and said that he was his son. The father, however, declared he had no son. He had never had but one, and he had been born like a hedgehog with spikes, and had gone forth into the world. Then Hans made himself known, and the old father rejoiced, and went with him to his kingdom. My tale is done, and away it has run to little August's house.